Rasial, the first Necromancer, is currently Necromancy's final boss in RuneScape 3. He's also the one who gives you that sweet tier 95 Necromancy gear, and has a lot to teach even full Revo warriors in improving bossing skills. Good day, everybody. First off, this video is timestamped, so if you want to get straight into the fight or the setup, please use those to bounce around. There's something very important I want to mention about fighting Rasial and my experience with it, especially for the full Revolution warriors and beginner PVMers watching. I think it's important, but if you don't, no offense taken if you skip around. There's no nice way to say this, but Rasial is absolutely not a beginner boss and cannot be done well with full Revolution at all, especially the final phase. If you picked this video to watch, it's likely because you wanted to hear the opposite, so I'm sorry to report that's not the case, but I do have some strangely good news. It is very likely that practicing fighting Rasial will ease you towards full manual combat more than you'd expect in a way that actually feels natural and not really annoying or too sweaty. I'm going to say like the other three combat styles. For reference, with all combat styles, I myself rely on Revolution except for ultimate abilities, and very few abilities for special occasions besides that hotkeyed, like a Resonance, or for most mechanics at bosses like Zook and Zamorak, some other abilities hotkeyed. However, after a few dozen kills of Rasial, which is to say after almost a dozen of Rasial's absolute slayings of me, I found myself very easily moving into full manual combat against him. I'm not sure if it's just Necromancy making this easier compared to other styles, but I do believe that it is one intended side effect of Necromancy. But that experience has also led me to create a very comfortable Revo bar with limited manual input that yields about the same results for me, so I think that can help you too, regardless of where you are at with combat experience here. So, with that said, what I will attempt to do in this guide is set you up with as close to full Revolution as possible and show you the gear and setup I use to stay alive. And this will help you. It'll be geared towards Rasial specifically, but honestly it'll carry you over to most other bosses. And with that said, I would like to disclaim now that my Rasial kills take about 2 minutes now. 2 minutes, 30 seconds if I'm using a Hellhound, but I'll get into that, or 2 minutes with a Blood Reaver. With that, my shortest kill is actually 1 minute and 51 seconds or so. Most of my kills now hover at about 2 minutes. If it's anything shorter than that, it's mostly due to dumb luck. So that's the baseline here to expect. Alright, here's my gearing. I strongly recommend tier 90 tank armor for learning, as the damage reduction is huge at almost 20% more than other tank armors, and the health boost is substantial as well. This is a huge help in dealing with some of Rasial's very damaging mechanics. Of course, I also recommend tier 90 Necromancy weapons at minimum as well. I was fortunate enough to get an Omni Guard as my first drop from Rasial at 24 kills. There are some run-throughs in this video that you'll see where I do use the Omni Guard instead of the tier 90 weapon. I promise it didn't make that much of a difference with how I was using it. A Salve Amulet E is the absolute best in slot necklace for Rasial and will boost your damage tremendously. Generally, I wouldn't call this required, but the Igneous, aka Zook cape for Necromancy is bread and butter for getting the kill times I mentioned here. Without this, Death Skulls is far inferior as an ability, and you'll miss out on a lot of damage. Speaking of Death Skulls, start every fight with Vulnerability Bombs. What do those have to do with Death Skulls? Well, if you don't know already, Death Skulls currently features what is most definitely a bug, in that each hit of it reapplies certain effects, including the Vulnerability Bomb's effect to the target. So the first hit of Death Skulls will get the 10% damage increase from the bomb, and the next will get a 20% increase, the next a 30%, and so on. This little bug slash feature appears to only apply to Death Skulls, but with the rotation I'll go over in this guide, you'll be firing off a lot of this ability, so the extra damage is ridiculous. There is slight talk of nerfing this or changing this in the future, but maybe keeping some of the damage ramping. I don't know how that'll look, but hopefully this guide still holds up once that change is made. For the very same reason, I recommend having the Undead Slayer perk on a weapon or armor, which gives a flat 7% damage increase against Undead. That includes Rasial, and as far as I know about this little bug, Death Skulls does multiply that also. One piece of similar ability that I don't have is the Undead Slayer ability from the Undead Slayer ability codex. My iron just has not done that grind yet, but that gives a 15% damage boost for 10 seconds. Fire that off with the Death Skulls, and it leads to even ridiculously faster kill times. For food, I strongly recommend only Ceradim Brews or another food of your choice that does not drain adrenaline. It's very important to keep adrenaline high for this boss, and Ceradim Brews provide a lot of healing per inventory space, especially if you use flasks. As you're learning Rasial, you'll probably be chugging these like an absolute degenerate, but as you get comfortable, you'll see your food consumption go way down. You can actually see in my recordings I'm lazily using 3-dose flasks of Saradomin Brew because I don't need that many anymore. But when I was first learning, I was going through an inventory of flasks, so don't be bothered if your first runs also look like that. Bring some of all 4 Necrotic runes, the Spirit, Bone, Flesh, and Miasma runes. It is to your great benefit to use Invoke Death if you're not using Power Armor, and if you're using the Tank Armor I recommend. I was going to say the Darkness spell is also great for raising evasion, but I just found out recently that Rasial doesn't use conventional accuracy for his attacks, so it doesn't matter because it doesn't work. I also heard that this is a bug because the dodging chance that Darkness applies is not supposed to be related to traditional accuracy, so if they fix it in the future, your Tank Armor will give you a roughly 10% dodge chance if you use the tier 90 set, and Darkness will give you a further 20% dodge chance, which means you'll be dodging 30% of hits, which is awesome. Invoke Death, on the other hand, applies a death mark on your next attack to the target. This spell lasts for 6 seconds, so make sure you hit Rasial within 6 seconds of using that, preferably right before the fight starts. If you're using Power Armor, there is a very solid chance that this mark will get applied anyways if you're using the standard Necromancy Power Armor, but what it does is that it will execute Rasial at 30,000 HP left if you apply it, so there's no reason not to. There's still a lot of gear left I have to go over. It's a long list, but there are 2 absolutely critical things to this fight that I want to touch on now. So the first is the Hellhound Familiar, and the second is one of a few auras you can pick from. The Hellhound Familiar is a must for learning because the 20% damage reduction is ridiculously helpful. Be mindful that the Hellhound takes that 20% damage itself, so while you're learning and taking tons of damage, there's a solid chance your Hellhound will die towards the end of the fight. But as you get better at this, you should be able to keep your Hellhound alive and just teleport to wars and use the little prayer crystal to restore its health. You can also keep it alive with a Prism of Restoration in the Ancient Spellbook. It's up to you if you don't mind one extra thing to keep an eye on. I will note quickly that once you're more comfortable with this fight, you can switch over to a Blood Reaver Familiar, and your kill times should drop by about 30 seconds. That's what I started doing. My kill times were hovering at about 2.5 minutes, and as soon as I switched to a Blood Reaver, the fight went pretty much the same. I was even using about the same amount of food as before. I don't really know why, to be honest, but my kill times shortened to about 2 minutes, so remember that for when you get more comfortable at this boss. The Aegis Aura is most recommended for learners, as it'll give you another 10% flat damage reduction. Between this, the Hellhound, and tier 90 Tank Armor, you'll have just about 50% damage reduction, which is awesome. In my experience, I found similar results and ease of sustaining my health using a Vampirism Aura. Most of the time I actually use a Penance Aura, now that I'm pretty comfortable actually. I only play on an Iron account, so I personally switch between Vampirism and Penance depending on which supplies I want to save more of, or just throw down some Penance Powder too and stick with Vampirism. And on that note, do make sure to bring Prayer Restoring Potions if you're not using a Penance Aura or Penance Powder. Once you start getting to around 2-minute kills, you should be able to actually finish the fight before your prayer totally runs out, and then you can just teleport to wars, but yeah, have a Super Restore Prayer Potion on hand. For the other finishing touches, bring an Excalibur. It is really handy in mid-fight or even at the beginning of a fight for added healing. Use your best Overload Potion, of course, or your best Necromancy Potion if Overloads aren't an option. For the pocket slot, I use a Scripture of Jazz. I hear this is a close competitor to even the Grimoire, Erethdor's Grimoire, at this fight, or with Necromancy in general, because you stack up such ridiculous damage with Necromancy that when the Scripture deals a percentage of it back, it hits quite hard. It's also pretty accessible to get and easier to get pages for than the Grimoire, cheaper at least. Have the best invention perks possible. I strongly recommend Enhanced Devoted, especially until you're ready to soul split the whole fight. Also, if you plan on being here a while, try to make some room for the Undead Slayer perk, as I mentioned before. It's fairly easy to get Precise 6 and Undead Slayer on a weapon. I don't remember how much it costs, and I also don't care because Iron Man. Having a high archaeology level can help you with this and other fights as well. I have the Fury of the Small and Conservation of Energy relics specifically that require respectively really high archaeology levels. That'll help a ton with all PVM. I keep Persistent Rage in my third slot for convenience, but another popular and much lower level option is the Darok relic that increases the damage output the lower your HP is. Since your HP won't be that high during this fight, for the most part, it's actually really helpful. I also have the Ring of Vigor passive effect, a reward from completing the Extinction quest. This gives back 10% adrenaline every time you use an ultimate, and combined with another 10% from Conservation of Energy, I get back 20% adrenaline every time I use Living Death or Death Skulls. Not gonna lie, this is really important for getting faster, sustainable kills in the way that I'm outlining in this guide. If you don't have one or both of these, you could use Adrenaline Potions to supplement, and it would be a great help. I don't usually, but you could use adrenaline potions regardless, and it'll help a little bit. During the fight, use Deflect Necromancy, not Soul Split. Soul Split is only sustainable if you're DPSing hard enough to get 1-minute kills, which if you're watching this guide, you're not. Rasial will eviscerate you otherwise. Only during the last phase with the bombs should you use Soul Split as a learner, because in that phase, he constantly turns off your Deflect Prayer anyway. If you're able to unlock the level 95 curse, by the way, called Sorrow, which requires level 90 Necromancy, and the curse is unlocked, it is by far the best combat prayer to use. You unlock Necromancy prayers if you don't already know by talking to the ghost lady here in the ghost chapel in the city of Otherwise, you'll have to stick with Leech Necromancy and Leech Necromancy Strength, or Necromancy Attack and Necromancy Strength, which honestly are way crappier than Sorrow. That's all for gearing, but I'm not taking you into the fight just yet. Let me show you the way I enter the fight and explain why I do it like this. At the entrance here, I drink an overload, then I conjure a zombie, then a skeleton, and right away enter the instance. Immediately upon entering the arena, I conjure my ghost. As soon as it's available, I use the ghost's command ability, and immediately after, I cast Invoke Death. This will be at the exact same time that Rasial appears, if I've timed it right, and I throw down a vulnerability bomb, and start the fight with Death Skulls. If it sounds complicated, let me break it down. With Necromancy combat in general, not just at Rasial, the way you enter a fight matters quite a lot. For now, until it's patched or changed, you can conjure your spirits without using up any adrenaline if you're not in combat. This means the ghost and zombie are free to conjure before you enter the fight. The ghost's extremely powerful command, which normally uses up 70% adrenaline, is also totally free to cast if you're not fighting yet. Please leverage this at Rasial or at any boss you fight with Necromancy. Even if this does get patched later, the gist from the updates on the RuneScape community page seem to be in favor of making this pre-fight conjuring tactic viable, so whatever happens, hopefully this advice is still applicable. Worst case, if the adrenaline cost becomes ridiculous outside of combat sometime in the future, you can always just pre-conjure everything at War's Retreat and use the adrenaline crystal to get your adrenaline back and then go into a portal and fight. So, to recap my entrance strategy, drink an overload dose, conjure the zombie, conjure the skeleton. As soon as I enter the arena, I conjure the ghost. You can follow up with the skeleton's command right afterwards if you want to have an extra little zing, but then make sure to follow up with the ghost's command. I wait until I'm in the arena to conjure the ghost because there's enough time to do so, and because the ghost actually has quite a short conjure time than the skeleton and the zombie, but its command is very powerful, so the main thing is that I want it in the fight as much as possible before I have to reconjure it. If you'd rather conjure all three outside and then run inside and use the ghost's command, totally fine. The necromancy entrance to a fight is really important, but it should be whatever's comfortable for you as well. It is very important to have the Death Skulls vulnerability bomb combo at the beginning of the fight because you'll be getting a lot of Death Skulls in with my strategy here under the vulnerability bomb for ridiculously buggy multiplied damage. Very, very lastly before the fight, we must review the ability rotation. Rotations, actually, several that I'll go over. Regardless of whether you prefer to try this with full revolution, semi-manual, or full manual, you must have at least one basic ability hotkeyed. This is because surviving the last phase of the fight is almost impossible, or at the very least a huge waste of food otherwise. I recommend hotkeying at least the Necromancy basic attack, and additionally Soul Sap and Touch of Death if you're willing to cycle through those. The last phase involves constantly moving while constantly attacking because standing still means dying very fast. It is just about impossible to do this with mouse clicks alone, but if you use a hotkeyed ability and immediately click to move somewhere, you'll do so without stopping. By the way, definitely keybind your bruise too. You will not want to run your mouse between walking and your inventory at any point during the final phase. There will be enough to worry about. For those wishing to give this a shot in full Revo, here's the bar I'd recommend, and here's a run where it worked well enough, until the last phase of course. One thing I did try was having Finger of Death in here at the very end of the bar, and it was still completely absurd. Please don't put Finger of Death on your full Revo bar, please just don't. It will break everything and you can't do it. Even at the very end of the Revo bar, it still fires off very often with no necrosis stacks up, so it just kills 60% adrenaline instantly. And it still goes off all the time because it has no cooldown. If you want to use Finger of Death, which you should, it's going to have to be keybound. Same goes for Bloat, which is good to use at least once during the fight, but again, if you put that anywhere on your Revo bar, it will just insta-kill 20% adrenaline very often. I'll also go over my preferred bar, which is semi-manual. I use only hotkeys to fire off Finger of Death, Volley of Souls, weapon special attacks, and for the final phase, I have hotkeys for the basic attacks, Soul, Sap Soul, Touch of Death, and Conjure Skeleton, and Conjure Ghost. Please also have Freedom hotkeyed. He's got one mechanic that stuns you, and it sucks. Also, hotkey Reflect and Debilitate, they are very helpful in the last phase. And hotkey Deflect Necromancy, that is the prayer you should be going in with, overhead. And Rasial turns it off very often, and you'll have to turn it back on quickly. As a start with the mostly full revolution bar I mentioned, really the only thing you'll need to keep an eye out is to fire off manually the Finger of Death when you have at least 6 Necrosis stacks, and the special attack of your standard weapon or Omniguard if you have it. Okay, now we're ready for the fight. About time. We've gone over the walk-in, the conjures, the Ghost Commander up, Invoke Death is set, and Vuln Bomb is thrown. Our rotation leads with Death Skulls. Keep your eyes on its hits to see how stupid it is with the Vuln Bomb bug. Now, where I'm standing, either at the very tip of this point in the ground or just above it, is where you need to be. It is very important to stay 3 to 6 spaces away from Rasial, ideally 3. If you're too close, he does annoying mechanics like Spectral Scythe and then running away. Then when you're too far, he conjures spirits very often. It's also important to not stay more than 5 spaces away from Rasial in case you have Death Skulls active. They will totally disappear if you have no target within 5 spaces to bounce to, and that is the biggest loss in damage you can possibly take in this fight. The main thing to look out for throughout the fight is A, eating if your health is too low, and B, when Rasial turns off your Deflect Necromancy prayer, turn it back on. This will happen a lot throughout the fight. For example, when he says suffer at my hand, it means he's Finger of Death blasting you, and your Deflect prayer will turn off shortly afterwards. Just wait like 2 seconds and then turn it back on. If you want to more actively watch out for when that's coming, just keep an eye on his Death Spark stacks up here. When they reach 5 now, I think, after the latest update, the Death Spark effect, that is the same effect on the Omniguard you get from him, will take effect and disable your overhead prayer. The other big hitter to look out for is his version of Volley of Souls. When he reaches 700,000 life points, soul obelisks will appear that slowly fill up his soul dots. Just like your Sap Soul ability, he will get 5 dots because of his nice Soulbound Lantern, and when they fill up, he blasts you with that too, right after he says, "This is true power." With a Deflect prayer up, each hit will do about 700, totaling about 3,500 probably for 5 hits. It's big, but not too terrible, especially with the health bonus from tank armor, and this is of course counting damage reduction from the tank armor. Activating Devotion will mitigate it completely. Better yet, having your Enhanced Devoted perk fire off will mitigate it as you snicker at his feeble volley. When Rasial reaches 400,000 HP, he will start using this Ghost Wall mechanic, and he can use it back to back if you're unlucky, so take note of that. It's pretty much like Terraket's Ghost Wall, if you're familiar with that from Elite Dungeon 3. You have to move out of the way before the ghosts touch you, or they'll deal over 3,000 typeless damage. The best way to do this is to move behind them by clicking 2 spaces behind you, which is where they spawn. So click directly on one of the ghosts behind you. If you do this quickly, you'll avoid damage. If you keep yourself 3 spaces away from Rasial like I mentioned, you'll still be in range for Death Skulls to keep bouncing after you step back. This is important. Don't try too hard to dodge this one. Using Escape or Dive will likely put you far away from Rasial and lead him to conjure annoying spirits. There is one more mechanic you are sure to see with kills taking longer than 2 minutes, which is his like charge, Spectral Scythe, whatever. He bashes into you, stunning you. Use Freedom right after he hits you and move a few spaces away and then continue attacking. That's how you deal with it. This attack also turns off your Deflect prayer and it disables it for a bit longer than his other mechanics. Just wait a few more seconds before you turn on Deflect from Necromancy again. This about sums up the first parts of the fight. When he reaches 200,000 HP, the real fight actually begins. He jumps up to this platform and starts throwing tons of bombs that do 2,000 damage each, give or take. He also permanently disables your Deflect Necromancy because all of his attacks, all his auto attacks that he still fires off at you, have the Death Spark effect. So for this part, just turn on Soul Split. This phase sucks because you will take a ton of damage, pretty much regardless of what you do, but once you get some practice in, you'll take less. As soon as this phase starts, use Reflect, ideally, assuming you have the Adrenaline and Bone Shield active for convenience, of course. Lesser Bone Shield is fine, by the way. It doesn't affect the duration of Reflect anyways. If you're really in trouble when it runs out, you can use Debilitate as well. The general strategy is to constantly run back and forth because if you sit still for even a tick, it seems like you get bombed hard, multiple times and killed easily. Now, the tricky thing is that you need to be attacking constantly while you're running around as well because you still have 200,000 damage to do. Hotkey your skeleton and your ghost if you want. It's really helpful for this, especially spam your skeleton's command for a bunch of damage whenever it's off of cooldown every 15 seconds. and focus primarily on using your basics hotkeyed to build up adrenaline. Click to run somewhere, hit an ability hotkey, and then immediately click to keep running is the general idea if you're not familiar with a strategy like this. My go-to pattern if my big hitters are on cooldown or if I'm just panicking and can't think of anything better is to use Soul Sap, then basic attack twice, then Soul Sap again. And maybe I'll peek at Touch of Death to see if it's off of cooldown and mix that in. Anybody who has done a lot of hard mode Zook in the final phase will be totally used to this, so you don't have to worry, but for anybody that hasn't done that, that's basically the way it goes as well. Remember to use Finger of Death and Volley of Souls when there are enough Necrosis stacks or Souls respectively. Ideally, you should use Death Skulls or even Living Death. They may be on cooldown if you're using my rotations here, but if they're not, just build Adrenaline as fast as you can and trigger them. Either one will make this phase go a lot faster. There are certainly more optimal ways to execute this phase. I mess it up a lot still. But if you're just learning and get thrown into it, wherever your Revo bar might be, this is the way I recommend surviving it and getting the kill. Once you get some kills in and you're not panicking as much during this phase, you can start avoiding damage by running in different patterns than just straight lines blindly back and forth. If you pay attention to the ground, there are dark spots where the bombs will damage you. Paying attention to click constantly where there are no dark spots will save you a lot of damage taken. The last thing I'll comment on this end is to be careful to not over-click in all of your panic. You can trip yourself up and prevent hotkeyed abilities from firing if you're clicking the ground too much at the same time. And of course, spam your brews and chug them all if needed to get out of this phase. It gets better with promise, I practice. Nope, it gets better with practice, I promise. Yeah, by the way, I'm not sure if it's noticeable, but for this run through, I'm really trying hard to stick to full Revo, even for this last phase, by just using my mouse to run and click Rasial to attack, but it's very painful. Your character will stop every time you click Rasial for a considerable amount of time in the context of this fight and take a lot of damage. I eventually lost my patience and went full manual with my ability firing to finish the fight. So sorry for not having a truly full Revo complete fight. It's I just don't think it's possible for the last phase. At the very least, if full manual is really not your speed yet, have just the basic attack and skeleton hotkeyed. The ghost is a plus, but at least your conjures will do some work alongside your basic attacks while you run around. I really recommend having at least Death Skulls and Finger of Death hotkeyed anyway too. They come in handy during this phase to deal heavy damage. Alright, that was the full Revo run through, almost at least. It took a bit over 3 minutes, and that's only because I got impatient and went full manual to the end. I want to show you now a slightly more manual input way of using this rotation that gives you a lot more benefit with kills as fast as around 2 minutes, but usually 2.5 minutes if you're still using a Hellhound familiar. I'm using my aforementioned semi-manual bar and paying the most attention to the first part of the fight because I lead with Death Skulls and Living Death and then as many Death Skulls as possible, which typically means 2 of them while Living Death is up. So the fight starts with a Vuln Bomb and Death Skulls. They bounce on their merry way and do stupidly increasing damage. I'm actually going full manual right afterwards because I want to only use Soul Sap and the basic attack until I get up to 100% adrenaline again. I do not want to use the skeleton command that's in my Revo bar just yet because it doesn't generate any adrenaline, and I want to save Touch of Death because it generates much more adrenaline if I wait until I'm under Living Death to use it. So I get back to 100% adrenaline as fast as possible and use Living Death. And here I use an adrenaline potion right after. I don't normally do this in my runs, but it did help a little bit for this run. If you have good adrenaline potions, definitely now is the time in your run to use it. My goal now, while I'm under Living Death for 30 seconds, is to fire off as many Death Skulls as possible. This is because that ability's cooldown is reduced from 1 minute to 12 seconds while Living Death is active. So I only use Touch of Death and Soul Sap and the basic attack again until I have 60% adrenaline and then give it another Death Skulls. Now I lay off the full manual and let my bar do the work. The thing is that you can build back to 60% adrenaline with this setup faster than the 12 seconds that Death Skulls is on cooldown, so I do manually fire off a Finger of Death or 2 when Necrosis stacks are full, and a Volley of Souls because I have 3 souls by now, and let the Revo bar activate the skeleton command too. With this kind of rotation, I'm not very max possible Death Skulls off. If I had Adrenaline Renewal Potions, I believe that's all it would take for me to fire off a total of 3 Death Skulls under Living Death. Anyway, once Living Death does run out, you'll still be able to fire off 1 more Death Skulls pretty soon because the 12-second cooldown will still have taken effect. then it goes back to its normal 1-minute cooldown. After that, I let the Revo bar do more work and just use Finger of Death and Volley of Souls whenever the Necrosis stacks or Souls are full, respectively. My DPS visibly dampens after Death Skull's Parade runs out, but I just roll with it. I use Excalibur and eat a little bit as needed until the final phase. I bring back my Ghost. Once I'm in the final phase, I switch to Soul Split and typically have plenty of adrenaline for Reflect at least. I'm trying to be more conscious of how I run around now to not walk into too many bombs, but mainly I go back to my 1 Soul Sap and 2 basic attacks manually until I get my bearings and think of what else to do. As I mentioned before, I keep an eye on Touch of Death and use that to build Necrosis stacks whenever it's available every 15 seconds. I make sure my skeleton is alive and I use its command when possible. I fire off Volley of Souls whenever I have 3 souls. Sometimes I summon my Ghost for kicks, chug some brews, and most importantly keep an eye on the cooldowns for Living Death and Death Skulls. I don't have a lot of consistency here in that regard. Sometimes one is off of cooldown much faster than the other. Death Skulls is preferable to get off in this phase, but if it's not close to cooling down and Living Death is, just use that. It's still better as it boosts the damage of Finger of Death, gets you a ton of extra adrenaline from Touch of Death, and allows you to quickly build adrenaline back for Death Skulls anyways, because it'll be off of cooldown thanks to the Living Death effect. And so that's it. I can't say it's a short and sweet guide, but this is my full Revo Warriors guide to Rasial. You will not be successful at this boss if you stick to only full Revo, but I hope that you find, like I did, that it's very easy to ease into manually firing off a lot of abilities. My keybinds personally are a mess, so I can't recommend anything there, because as I've mentioned, I've never full manualed anything in RuneScape before, and I never had to keybind so many abilities. But it came really easily and naturally to me because I convinced myself that I should learn Rasial. It took a lot of deaths, but now he honestly feels easy. Even my kill times are improving a little bit, even if they're not the absolute greatest. Anyways, I really hope this helps the beginners out there. High level combat is really tough for a lot of us to learn in this game, and I hope Necromancy helps you like it helped me. If you found this video helpful, please consider liking it and subscribing to my channel for other helpful guides. Thank you for watching, I appreciate you very much, and I'll catch you in the next one.